abbiamo la seconda keynote che è Jennifer Uzzell. Jennifer è direttrice di pompe funebri ed è anche ricercatrice accademica. Lei è un'esperta di funerali neopagani. Lei stessa è druida. Eh, Jenny! Hi!
Hi, how you doing?
I'm wonderful. You?
Yeah, not so bad, not so bad.
No bad? Are you in the office?
I am. I'm actually in the office. Yeah,
Perfect.
it's
Jenny.
likely slightly less messy in the background that way.
No, no, it's wonderful. If you how beautiful it is.
Yeah, I notice it's brilliant.
Yeah? You have to come back to Italy. Jenny, you have 40 minutes. Do whatever you want.
Okay.
It's all yours. And then
Am
we're
I
going to
okay
have,
to share a slideshow?
yes, you can share everything you want.
Brilliant. Okay, I will jump straight in. First of all, can I just apologize to everybody that I'm speaking English?
No,
Okay, so yes, I am a bit of a strange concoction, which I think is probably what Giorgio has asked me to speak about. So, my partner Keith and I, we own a funeral home in the northeast of England, and it's a slightly unusual funeral home. And I mean, Giorgio has told me something about what the funeral service looks like in Italy, and I know that it is very, very different here. So I will try to explain as I go along. So basically, I think some things that are in common. Almost all funeral homes in Britain are owned by either they're owned by big corporations, Dignity or the Co-op or Funeral Partners, or they're owned by families that have been doing it for generations. Mostly they're men. Mostly they wear black suits a lot. There's a lot of black cars. And Keith and I are part of a movement that is challenging that and that is trying to sort of drag the funeral world into the 21st century by doing things a little bit differently. And I will talk about that a little bit more as we go along. So my background academically is also quite odd. My first degree is in biblical studies, actually. I'm a textual critic first and foremost, specializing in the Old Testament. So I did biblical Greek, I did Hebrew, I did quite a bit of archaeology, that sort of thing. And then I taught religious studies for about 20 years in Britain in secondary schools, including A level, which is the 2 years pre-university. And then I did a master's degree. And the master's degree was at Lampeter and it was in world religion. And I was still teaching at this point. Now, I didn't set out to do the master's degree on death. That was not the intention. It is, however, kind of what happened. So I ended up doing essays on things like near-death experience, the Hellenistic mystery cults and how they related to early Christianity around baptism and Eucharist, which might not sound like it's about death, but trust me, it is. And where reincarnation first appears in the Hindu Vedas. Hinduism was an interest that I acquired while I was teaching. And being me, went off down a rabbit hole and read up a lot about it. And as a result of that, I ended up being a senior examiner in the country. So I set, mark, and lead the teams of people that mark GCSE and A-level exams on Buddhism, Hinduism, and philosophy and ethics. And I've started doing a bit of biblical studies recently as well. So all of that is still ongoing. While I was doing my master's, a number of fairly big things happened. I was quite ill. I got divorced. And sometime later, I met Keith, who is my current partner, who was at that time working as a funeral director for Dignity. So that was quite odd. And then a number of other things happened. Long, twisty story. It's one of those things that when you, from the perspective of the present, you look back at it, it kind of looks like a novel. It looks like a story. It looks like something very improbable that was planned. It wasn't, but it very much feels like that. So if you believe in fate, there was a lot of fate going on. The result of which was that we ended up owning a funeral home. I had no background in funerals whatsoever. Keith does not come from a funeral directing family. Before he was doing this, he worked briefly in mental health and then he worked as an antique dealer. So, and he found himself by a strange series of events working for a major funeral director. And when we had the chance to have our own funeral home, which I will show you a little bit about if I can, there we go. So this is us, Saint and Foster Funeral Directors Limited. This picture over here on the top right, my top right, that's not the funeral home, I hasten to add. That is my old school. We were there for a reunion, but it's just quite a good photo of what we look like now. Around there, you have pictures from the outside, pictures of the inside. You can see it probably doesn't look very much like what you expect a funeral home to look like, and that is very deliberate. So what we did basically was we set out to take all the conventions and all the unwritten rules about how you should run a funeral home and break as many of them as seemed suitable at the time. So when Keith was working for Dignity, for example, he was told that the office needed to be as plain and as bland as possible, as little colour as possible, because anything else was disrespectful. And I think one of the things that happened is that I came in with no background in funeral directing whatsoever and basically said, what? Why? Explain to me how it's disrespectful. And so we didn't do that. As you can see, we went for a place where, given that we are sometimes working there for 14, 15 hours a day, we wanted somewhere where we felt comfortable, where we felt at home. And our thinking was, if you have to go into a funeral home, then the chances are that you are not in a good place. The chances are that you are grieving, that you are anxious, that you are worried. And the last thing you need to do is to encounter somebody in a black suit sat behind a desk waving a clipboard at you. So we try not to do that. So this is us. And as you will see from this and from this logo here, not long after we started getting involved, well, not long after we took over Saint and Foster and started changing how it worked, we got involved with something called the Good Funeral Guide. Now, the Good Funeral Guide is a British organisation. It's actually a public interest company. I can't remember what that's actually called. It's an ICI and I can't remember what it stands for. But it exists basically to try and make sure that people get better funerals. And it is a lobbying body. And quite early on, I found this online and I said to Keith, I think we need to hook up with these people. I think we need to try and, get established with them. By that time, I was already posting and contributing to their blog. And through that, got chatting to the guy in charge at the time, whose name was Charles Cowling. And one of the things we were doing at the time was that we were having a long conversation about whether or not we should put our price list onto our website. Now, at the time in Britain, this was something that you just did not do. And when I suggested it to Keith, his immediate reaction, having been trained by Dignity, was, no, you don't want to do that. We can't do that. We can't do that because it's disrespectful. This is their blanket answer to everything, I think. So I said, why is it disrespectful? And the result was a long silence. And I spoke to Charles Cowling, and he said, no, absolutely, you should put your prices on your website. He put us in touch with another one of the Good Funeral Guide's funeral directors who'd been doing it for a while. And they got involved. They said, yes, we've done it. It's actually made our lives much better. You should do it. So we did. So we are now one of the recommended funeral directors for the Good Funeral Guide. There's a number, they're all independent funeral directors, and this is the Good Funeral Guide. So there you go, community interest company. That's what I was looking for. So this guy down here, this is Charles Cowling. This is the guy who set it up, and he set it up as a lobbying body to challenge the status quo. So he called out funeral directors who were dishonest. And on one occasion, he sort of hounded one through several incarnations until the guy wound up going to prison. He tried to publicize to the public as much as possible what they should be demanding from a funeral director, and generally to raise expectations about funerals so that they should not be bland things that happen to you, particularly non-religious funerals, because religious funerals are to some extent easy because there is a set pattern. Everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to be doing. With non-religious funerals, which are now certainly in England, the majority of funerals are non-religious. There's no such idea. There's no such, people are very pleased. People are very willing to accept a very mediocre funeral, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's nothing inspiring, there's nothing useful about it. And Charles Cowling started the conversation. What is a funeral for? What should it be achieving? What is its purpose? And it sort of started those conversations. Now, he retired in 2010-11, and the organisation was taken over by Fran Hall, who had been the manager of a natural burial site, and she had also been a funeral director. And she has taken the GFG into being a community interest company and into trying to have a voice in government. So some of the things that have happened, we have conferences basically to reassure each other that what we're doing isn't mad, that being the ones that are maybe colourful. A lot of the Good Funeral Guide companies are owned or run by women, which is also quite unusual. Many of us rarely wear suits. And sometimes we just need to be told that we're not the crazy ones. So we have conferences, we talk about how we can make funerals better, how we can make rituals better. We commission research into, for example, one piece of research done by GFG Funeral Company recently was on whether or not seeing the body of somebody that you've lost is useful after they've died. And they did a piece of research on that. We aim to influence government policy. Now, this news may not have reached you in Italy, but there was a huge scandal about a year ago here with a funeral director in Hull, not very far away from where I am, who was doing some very, very unethical things indeed. Basically, he was telling people that bodies had been cremated when they hadn't been. He was storing bodies in a warehouse. He was giving people back things that he told them were their relatives' cremated remains that weren't. And as a result, there's been a call for more legislation around funeral directors. And the Good Funeral Guide has been involved in talking to the government about that. And also, about 3 years ago, the government had the Monopolies Commission, the Competition and Markets Authority, looked into the way funerals were marketed and presented and tried to come up with a fairer way of doing that protected the bereaved as being vulnerable people. And the top right-hand picture was when the Good Funeral Guide went and spoke to them and gave them a bit of a surprise, I think, because they were not like any other, we were not like any other funeral related company that they had spoken to. We made them cry once or twice, which I'm quite proud of. This down here, this is not the Good Funeral Guide. This is Fran Hall acting independently, who is the main trustee of the Good Funeral Guide. And this is the National COVID Memorial Wall. And each of those hearts is dedicated to somebody that died during the COVID epidemic, with COVID listed as their cause of death. And the purpose of the wall was and is to call the government to account for things that they did that were perhaps not helpful. So there I am. So I'm now a co-owner, co-directory of a progressive funeral home, trying to influence and change funerals. And because I didn't have enough to do, I thought I would do a doctorate. So this is with the Centre for Death and Life Studies in Durham University, which is just down the road and which is where I met Giorgio. He was doing his doctorate at the same time as me. And my doctorate, again, looking at religion, this time looking at very minority religion, a group in Britain called the Druids, which probably takes a bit of further explanation. So the Druids, they take their inspiration, obviously, from the Iron Age Druids who were active in Britain and Gaul and probably Ireland in the Iron Age and into the Roman period and possibly beyond, although that's contentious. We know very little about those Druids. They are a source of inspiration that is really about it. The modern Druid movement has its roots in Celtic revivalism and Celtic nationalism and the Romantic poetic movement. So from about the 1740s onwards, there are things happening that led to the movement of Druids as it exists at the moment. It resulted in three different kinds of Druids that are with us today. There are the Masonic Druids, I think speaks for itself. There are cultural Druids who are concerned with bardic arts, poetry, music, song, storytelling, and particularly the preservation of Celtic languages, such as Welsh and Cornish in particular, and Scottish Gaelic. And there are spiritual or religious Druids, which is where my research is concerned. So religious Druidry has its roots really in a movement called the and I've stitched up, has its roots in a movement in the turn of the century, early 1900s, that was inspired by socialism, also by turn of the century occultism, the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical movement in particularly, and all of this sort of fed into what became the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. Early influences on Druidry, I'm going to go through this very quickly. William Stukeley in the 18th century, who claimed to be a Druid, and who was responsible for a lot of the archaeology around Stonehenge and Avebury. He believed that Stonehenge and Avebury had been built by Druids, which we now know is not correct. But again, if you consider that when he was writing, everybody believed that the world had been created about 5,000 years ago, and therefore there wasn't really much further back than the Druids that he could go. We now know that the stone circles are much older than the Druids, but at least he didn't say the Romans built them, which is what everybody else was saying. Probably the biggest influence on modern Druidry was a guy called Iolo Morganwg, who was a Welsh scholar, again writing in the late 18th to early 19th century. And his writings have had a massive influence on modern Druid ritual, something called the Druid prayer, the symbol of Druidry, the Arwen. All of these things go back to Iolo Morganwg. I'm going to go over this quite quickly because I'm aware of time. And then Ross Nichols, who took over the order of bards, ovates, and druids, and he really is responsible for the fact that Druidry became part of the pagan revival movement in the 1960s and 70s. And the majority, but by no means all, modern religious Druids would describe themselves as pagans. And that has a lot to do with Ross Nichols and what he did to Obod. Ross Nichols died unexpectedly in 1975, and Obod went into remission for a while until it was revived by a young man that Ross Nichols had taught called Philip Carr-Gomm in around 1984. So the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druidry today is, this is an earlier thing. If you look at Druidry now, it's a lot more colourful than that. We don't all wear identical white robes. Oh, and yes, I did say we. I am a Druid. But Philip is a psychoanalyst, and he took it in very much a psychotherapeutic direction and in a pagan way. This is what Obod looks like today. As you can see, it's a lot more colourful. This is Philip Carr-Gomm, who stood down as the chosen chief 2 years ago and has been replaced for the first time by a woman, an Irish lady called Emma Burke, who is wonderful. This guy up here is Dave the Bard, who is the Pendragon of Obod and who is a musician, very successful musician in certain circles. And this guy up here with Dave and his wife Kerry, who is an amazing writer and liturgist, is Christopher Hughes, a Welsh Druid who is also a mortician. He's recently done a fabulous series of TV programs in the Welsh language, but there are subtitles available, about how death rituals work in Indonesia, America, India, and Mexico. But he is a really well-known death scholar within Druidry and has written a book called As the Last Leaf Falls, which is about Druidry and death. Okay, so Ronald Hutton, who is the foremost scholar in Britain on the history of paganism, has described Druidry as a complex of religions calling on ancient images and ideas, but addressing some of the greatest needs of modernity, and in doing so, drawing on major streams of British culture, going back over 200 years, and a continuous tradition of ceremonial magic going back millennia. So that is kind of what it is. So my research is specifically about how Druids do death. Now, if I had to say, and I did for my PhD, what is distinctive about Druidry compared to other pagan traditions in Britain, I would say that the concern with the ancestors, the concern with reciprocity and relationship to a wider than human world. So an idea, it's often put as a veneration or a connection with nature, but that sounds very trite to me. And what does nature mean? And that's a whole chapter. But it's to do with the idea that humans are not the only things in the world, and they're not the only things with rights. And so we have this idea of reciprocity and relationship with gods for some people, with spirits for some people, with ancestors, however they're understood for most Druids, with the ecosystem, the animals, the rivers, the mountains that are in your area, All of these things are deeply important to Druids, as are the bardic arts, so the arts of storytelling, music, singing, poetry, as being ways in and of themselves of connecting with the divine. And obviously, rituals, we have a series of 8 festivals. We are currently right in the middle of Beltane, which is the spring festival. So tomorrow I'm going to be at a major festival in Thornborough Henge, which is a Neolithic site very close to me, to celebrate Beltane. But there are 8 of those over the year, and they mark the changing of the seasons. So it's a way of connecting yourself to the world around you. It won't surprise you. We have, I think, Britain started a guy called Ken West, who was in Carlisle, which again is quite close to where I am, in the 1990s, started in Britain the natural burial movement. So this is where people are buried in woodland or in meadows or in pastures with no gravestones to mark it. And the idea is that they decompose naturally, that the nutrients in their body go back to the earth, and that people can come to basically a beautiful landscape to remember them. This is something that is now very big in England in particular. There are, I think, as many natural burial grounds now in England as there are crematoria. And this one, Sunrising, is owned by Druids. The people in this picture over here are prominent Druids, and Emma, who was one of the founders of the British Druid Order and of the Druid Network, has now retired from all of that and is concentrating on running Sunrising. So the idea here, the idea, and this very much conflates with what my supervisor Douglas Davies found about natural burial in general, that the idea is giving back to the land, the ultimate gift of your body to the land. So this is my main interest. I get very excited about barrows. So this is a place called All Cannings. It was built in 2014, and it is built to resemble Neolithic long barrows where people were buried in the Neolithic period. The guy sitting next to it is Tim Dorr, the landowner, whose idea it was, and it was built using the same methods that the Neolithic tombs were built using. Now, to use it for the burial of bodies would be problematic for a number of reasons. So what it actually has inside it is niches, you can see them down here with candles in them, that urns of cremated remains go into. Now, I think it took 3 years for every niche, there's about 300 of them, to be sold. So this is something that people really like. They really want to do it. And this is why I was very interested by them. So there are pagans, there are druids that have niches. There are also this guy. This is some of the newspaper articles about All Cannings. And I just love this photo. This photo is just here because I love it. Hang on, I don't know why that happened. Why did that happen? We're having a few issues here. There we go. So this guy up here, the one with the feather in his hat, this is a guy called Terry Dobney, who was the Archdruid of Avebury. He died a few years after this photo was taken. He was there at the opening and the dedication of All Cannings, and his cremated remains are in the barrow. And one of the last interviews I did for my PhD was with his wife, who was incredibly generous and sent me video clips and photos of his funeral. It was absolutely amazing. So the place is connected with Druids, and although there are pagans, there are atheists, there are all sorts of people, there are Christians whose cremated remains are in there. It is designated legally as a Druid place of worship, one of only 2 in England. This is Willow Row. I'm going to go through this one very quickly. This one is modelled on a Bronze Age barrow, so it's round rather than long. But I was researching in time to be taking some photos of the building of this one. And one thing I find very interesting about this one is that this is the car park up here. And you have to, I'm going to stop moving this. This is not working at all. But you basically have to walk along this track where you can't see the barrow. And then you go round a bend and you suddenly see the barrow. So there is effectively a processional route to the barrow. I'm going to stop pointing at things with my cursor because that seems to annoy it. So moving on, I think I have probably about 5 minutes. Is that right, Georgia?
Yes.
Yep. So things that are common to the way that Druids do funerals and the ritualisation of death. So firstly, this sense of connection with the ancestors. So many pagans think that what pagans conceive the ancestors to be is very diverse. So in Druidry, we talk about ancestors of blood, place, and tradition. So blood is fairly self-explanatory. It's your genetic ancestors. Ancestors of place are the people that have lived where you are before you. And people is not necessarily restricted to human beings. It can mean getting to know the landscape, the stories about the gods, or the mythical figures that were there. It can mean studying the history of the animals that were there. And tradition, ancestors of tradition are people that have made you who you are. So that can mean, so for Druids, people like Ross Nichols and Iolo Maganog would be seen as ancestors of tradition. For others, I mean, your PhD supervisor might be an ancestor of tradition. You know, they're people who formed your thinking. I would suggest that for a lot of Druids, there is also a fourth category, which is very un-Druidic. We tend to do things in threes, of tribal or cultural ancestors, because most Druids feel this sense of connection with the pre-Christian ancestors. And it's a sort of a homogenous, they're not individual ancestors. It's an idea of connection to this pre-Christian, more democratic past. And that takes us on to probably one of the biggest festivals of the year. Happens at about the time of the Day of the Dead and Halloween, and it is called Samhain. It's pronounced Samhain, and lots of things go on. But the basic idea is that it's an annual ceremony to remember and honour the ancestors, and that includes people that you have lost in the last year. And I think this is an incredibly useful and beneficial thing to do. And I know that you do this in Italy much, much better than we do it here. Here, it is only really religious minority groups that do this, you know, so Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists do it, and pagans do it. But that's about it. There is no real mainstream. People get dressed up at Halloween in spooky costumes, but the idea of really seriously remembering, honouring, connecting with the dead is not something that we do in England very well, but Druids do it brilliantly. So pictures here, the candles at the top, this is taken from a Samhain ritual in Anglesey that Christopher Hughes presided over. The candles, each of those, somebody has said something about a person they've lost that year and placed the candles there. And you'll see behind that there are some service orders from funeral services that have taken place. The bottom right with the horse's skull, this is called a Mary Lloyd. This is something else I'm very interested in. I have one. And the Mary Lloyd in Druidry, the wider history of it is much more complicated, but in Druidry, it's seen almost as a psychopomp. It comes out at Samhain, it goes back into storage in usually late January or February, and it's seen sort of as a goddess of winter that conducts the souls of the dead onto the other land, onto the next place. All of this, any single one of these things, I could give you an entire lecture on. So this is really a very quick overview. So there should be another one there. We seem to have missed one. The one we seem to have missed is why does it matter? Why is all of this important? Let me just... There we go. There it is. So, why does it matter? It matters because Druid funerals and Samhain rituals focus on connection, whether that be to ancestors, to nature, or to the wider than human world. And in our increasingly secular world, we have lost that connection. So, like I said, religious funerals, everybody knows what they're doing and everybody knows why they're doing it. In secular funerals, there's this vague idea of celebrating somebody's life. And you often have a civil celebrant who has done a brilliant job of finding out about that person's life and then telling it back to people that already know it because they are the family of the person that's died. And that has its place and it's great. But with the loss of the Christian funeral, mostly Christian, we've lost the ritual, we've lost the liturgy, we've lost that sense of the sacred and of doing something really important and pretentious. And usually the bereaved sit there and they're spoken at by whoever is taking the funeral. So that's one problem with modern secular funerals. And also, another feature of the modern world is that we have an increasing environmental concern and awareness. And, you know, funerals are not good environmentally, generally speaking. So, my contention, my argument is that we can use the ritual literacy, this proficiency, this expertise in liturgy, in ceremony, in ritual that we find in Druidry to allow the bereaved who might not have a specific religious tradition to take control of their funerals, to take a bigger part in them themselves, and to be actively involved and to take part in ritual. So it's not just about words, it's about things that you do as well. Whether that be standing in a circle around the coffin, whether that be touching it, whether that be applause for the person that's died, whether that be in Druid funerals, the elements of earth, air, fire, and water are brought into funeral ceremonies. So actually doing things. What I have found is that Druid rituals in general and funeral rituals in particular are rooted in an imagined past. We know very little about the original Druids, but modern Druids imagine into their sacred world, but they look towards the future. They take what is valuable and they bring it towards the future. And my contention is that by doing the same thing, we can find the future of meaningful funerals in the 21st century by looking towards the past. And that is really what I have to say. I know what I did. I put it in the wrong place. Let me just get that last screen on. I do beg your pardon with this. I'm going to put one last screen up and I'm going to shut up.
No.
He's going to put this one up. I'm going to share that. I'm going to play from current slide. So there you go. So that is my contact details if anybody is interested in speaking to me, and that's me done.
Wonderful. Do we have question? I think there was one. You have to come here. Direttamente in inglese. Bene, tutto tuo.
Hi. First
Hi.
of all, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was a real pleasure listening to you. And then I wanted to ask you actually a question about your personal experience as a funeral director, because I personally know a woman funeral director in Italy, and let's just say she doesn't have it easy because it's constantly met with prejudice, stereotypes, and a lot of opposition, especially from her colleagues, from her male colleagues. And so I wanted to ask you if it's the same in England or if maybe the situation is better.
I think the situation is better. I don't think it's perfect. I think we are a few years ahead of you in terms of where the funeral industry is. And from what I've learned, we're also a few years behind places like the Netherlands and Belgium. So we're sort of kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not that unusual now to see a female funeral director. Even in the big companies, even in the Co-op and Dignity, there are female funeral directors. What we are finding, I am not coming across much prejudice because I'm a woman. Most of the prejudice that we come across, to the extent that there is a funeral director in our town who once actually walked into a lamppost rather than having to admit that he'd seen us and therefore have to say hello. And that's because we don't look like funeral directors. So even the female funeral directors, you will see a lot of black suits. And you saw from our pictures, I mean, my partner has long hair and a beard. That's unheard of in funeral directors. That's where more of the prejudice comes from, that we do things differently and we try to get things changed. So I think I said when we first started and we put our prices online, Keith was very nervous of doing that because the word in the funeral industry was, no, you can't do that. It's terrible. Don't do it. Right. That was 14 years ago. It's now illegal not to. So the movement that I belong to has changed funerals, I would say very much for the better. And that still gets a degree of prejudice. People don't like anything that changes the norm, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Any other question? Curiosity? I have one. There was actually a reason that I call you. The thing is that you're a funeral director and you are a scholar. How these two identities are supporting each other, opposing each other, making you a better scholar and a better director? Like, is a journey that would you suggest beyond the stress, the time, and all? How did you feel enriching each other?
Okay, it's not easy, I'll say that. Time, stress. I think for me, it was something I couldn't not do once I'd got involved in funerals because I am kind of an academic to the core. I can't not do it. And so when I started getting involved with Saint and Foster, even though I had my master's at that point, but I wasn't doing anything else. But my natural reaction to, oh, look, I now half own a funeral home, is to start researching. So, what are the laws around funeral companies? What is the norm? What's wrong with this? This is how I found the Good Funeral Guide. What needs changing? Is it true that cremated remains help plants to grow? And the answer to that is no, by the way. So, I go looking for things. And I had always, the only thing I have consistently wanted to do since I was 17 is a PhD. And so it was inevitable I was going to do it eventually, but what I wanted to do it in changed several times over that period. And it just seemed natural to bring together the two halves of my life, so the Druid half of my life and the death half of my life, together into academic, which is the third half of my life, which is why I never have any spare time. Do I recommend it? It's a lot of work. But yes, because it gives me an insight into what I'm doing. I watch myself with what I'm doing. It gives me a degree of presence. I'm not going to say authority, that's going too far. But for example, when the Good Funeral Guide was doing its consultation with the Ministry of Justice over the regulation of funerals, I was called in on that consultation because being an academic gave me more that I could contribute to it. It gave me a degree of gravitas. So I'm finding that being an academic as well, it's getting me onto more media platforms. It's getting me talking to people about funerals. So I do some work with the Religion Media Centre, and they do press conferences. And I'm quite often, if there's death or funerals are involved, I'm usually on those press conferences. So at the moment we have, and I know you hate this as much as I do, this huge rise in Britain in direct cremation, and it's got even worse since the last time we spoke about it. And the Good Funeral Guide is trying to educate people about direct cremation, what it actually is, any false advertising that's going on, and what questions you should be asking about it. And again, because I've done research into this, I get brought into designing a lot of those surveys. On the other side, there are, and you will also be aware of this, I think, there are an awful lot of people in death studies at every level who are talking quite confidently about death and bereavement and the dead, who have never actually seen one. And this is one of my big bugbears at conferences like the DDD, that I feel a lot of the conversations are not as helpful as they could be because people don't actually know what they're talking about. They know what all the scholarship says, but until you have spent time with a dead body, and until you have spent time with somebody who is spending time with the dead body of one of their relatives, there's a whole lot of things that you don't understand. And I think bringing that side of my experience and also the practical side of running funerals into the academic discussion of funerals and death and bereavement is something that there is far too little of, and that I would say there needs to be a lot more of that going on. So, for instance, I was at a conference last week, the Closures Conference at Durham, and one of the things that was being discussed was composting as a new technology that is coming in for the disposal of dead bodies. It's something that I am very much in favour of. And Brenda was speaking about it. And the discussion afterwards made it very clear to me that pretty much nobody in that room had any actual practical knowledge of how a body decomposes. And that led into what to me were some very stupid questions that, because they didn't know the answers, and why would they, meant that the conversation was not going in as productive a direction as it could. So I think that sort of thing. So I think it goes both ways. I think being an academic makes me more self-critical, more thoughtful as a funeral director. It makes me more likely to look below the surface and go researching and go finding things out. And it gives me a presence and a sort of an authority when talking to outside bodies. And I think being a funeral director helps me to bring into academia a whole layer of experience that is very much missing from it at the moment.
Yeah. Were you thinking bullshit when they were saying this?
A little bit.
Were you thinking about me in the situation?
Yeah. I know what Giorgio would say.
Humanist funeral celebrant in Italy, trained with the BHA.
And you're from which part of England?
From York.
Oh, hi, just down the road.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned composting because I actually wanted to ask you earlier what you thought of methods other than cremation and burial.
Mhm.
Composting is one, permission is another, resumation is another. A whole series of things coming through, all with different energy inputs and different exits. And I wondered, in a context in which in Italy we have been discussing for a number of years changes in the legislation, all of these alternative technologies are forbidden at the moment. And there is a strong lobby in favor of cremation, which is not energy efficient. I wondered, as a funeral director and someone who is involved in a legislative situation in which you have much greater freedom, how you would rank these different options. But before you answer, I'm just going to rephrase the question in Italian so that people are following. Ho chiesto semplicemente pur riconoscendo che la situazione in Italia non consente opzioni oltre la cremazione e la sepoltura.
Cremazione a fuoco, perché
Cremazione
nemmeno
a
quella
fuoco.
d'acqua fanno fare.
Ma quella sì, ok.
Sì.
La situazione in Gran Bretagna è diversa, in altre legislazioni è diversa e ci sono tutta una serie di nuove tecnologie sostanzialmente interessanti con input energetici molto minori. Ho fatto una piccola lista, Jenny ha riconosciuto queste cose. Le ho chiesto, in un contesto in cui stiamo cercando di fare pressione finalmente per cambiamenti della legislazione italiana, se lei volesse farci un graduatorio di questi metodi alternativi, ehm, dal suo punto di vista, che è un punto di vista pratico e teorico. Oh, over to you, Jenny.
Okay. That's actually really, really interesting question. Thank you. Okay, so one thing that contextualizes this, I think, is that cremation is very popular. In England, cremation now accounts for, I would say, 75 to 80% of funerals. And we have far, far more freedom than I think just about anybody else in Europe with regards to what we do with cremated remains. Hence, barrows can happen, and they kind of couldn't in a lot of Europe. I'm aware of that. And all three of the methods that we've been discussing produce something that can be treated in a similar way to cremated remains. And in Britain, that is quite important because people like to be able to do something with those, whether it's to put them into a barrow, whether it's to make them into jewelry, whether it's to scatter them in an important place, whether it's to bury them in a family grave, whether it is, and I'm not joking, to put them into fireworks. All of these things are things that people do in Britain with cremated remains. So to have something that you can do those things with at the end is quite important. Promession. Promession was an idea that somebody came up with. I think there was a lot of talk about it when we first started in St. Foster's. That would be about 14 years ago. And the idea was that you can freeze dry a body effectively, and then you can vibrate it so that it falls into bits. Basically, it becomes powder. I've not heard sight nor sound of promession for over 10 years. I think they never successfully demonstrated that it could be done. The lady that was pushing it, and I heard her speak at the National Funeral Directors Conference once, years and years and years ago, claimed that they had successfully done this, I think, with the body of a pig, and was never able to provide any evidence that they had. So promession, I think, has kind of dropped out of the equation, at least for the time being. Resumation. Resumation is something that is very current and very much in the news at the moment. Resumation is where a body is put into a tank with very strong alkali liquid under pressure, and the body is effectively dissolved. The water part, the liquid part, is then purified and put back into the sewage system. The skeletal remains exactly the same as with cremation. They're put through a cremulator and ground to powder, and the powder is then returned to the family. This is being pushed as an ecologically friendly alternative to cremation because it uses a lot less energy, because it doesn't use gas, because it isn't heated. And there is discussion apparently, and I asked this question in a conference about this at Durham a number of years ago. The liquid could, in theory, be used as a fertilizer, but nobody seems to be planning to do that. And there is now a resumator in County Durham, not far from Durham. There is one of these machines. It's not licensed for use as yet. And one of my colleagues at Durham did her PhD in resumation. And I spoke at the Closures Conference. The company director was there. There is a research assistant at Durham at the moment who is working on a joint project with the company on resumation. And they are inviting funeral directors and celebrants to go and see the machine that does this. And what the celebrants seem to be feeding back is that it needs a new ritual. There is no ritual around this. People have been doing rituals with fire for as long as there's been fire, as long as people have been using fire. Fire has been a sacred ritual thing. We know how to deal with fire ritually. Resumation, or as some people are calling it, water cremation, is a different symbolic, a different ritual language. And I think one of the celebrants suggested, for example, that there needed to be a fountain and that the liquid from the resumation flows into the fountain that you can sit around, and then it flows back into the water system. All of this is good stuff. Taking my academic hat off and just putting my human being hat on, my emotional reaction to resumation is not a good one. I imagine that people are going to be feeling, even, you know, if it's not strictly true, the feeling you're going to be getting is we're flushing grandma down the drain because that's where the water goes. And it is seen as not being important in the process. So the only thing that is seen as important is the skeletal remains that are returned in the same way as cremated remains. To me, they are missing the obvious way forward with this, which is what do you do with that liquid? And if you can turn that into a fertilizer that can go onto fields, then we're away. And there is no DNA in it. There is no, you know, it's not dangerous liquid. The third one, which is more recent still, is composting. This is being done in America quite widely, and Christopher Hughes in his programs on death rituals in different countries, he looked at composting in America as part of that. And he came back quite convinced that this was a good way forward. And he is now advocating in Britain for the legalization of composting. I have heard him say it was a Druid who started the conversation that legalized cremation, which it was. It was a guy called William Price in the early 1800s. And he said it's going to be a Welsh Druid again that is responsible for the move towards composting. This is his intention. Composting involves putting the body into a vessel or a pod, they're being called, I believe, in Germany, with compost, with it basically relies on the microbiome in your own body to decompose you. And by the managing of airflow and temperature, and in some cases gentle agitation and other things that are put into the pod, the decomposition process can be managed to take, I think in Germany they're doing it in 40 days, which of course is a symbolic number in a lot of religions. And in America, I think they were saying 3 months. And what you get out of that genuinely is compost. And again, skeletal remains, which are put through a cremulator and can be returned separately. So what you pick up at the end of the day is several bags of compost and the cremated remains. Now, in Germany, where this is partially legal, the cremated remains are then mixed back into the compost, where they are less harmful, I would say, in that sort of proportion. And this I find absolutely bizarre, I have to say, the compost is buried in a grave in a cemetery, which seems to me to miss the entire point of doing it. Brenda, who spoke about this at the conference, says that she feels this is a halfway house with regards to getting around legislation, because in Germany what you can do with a dead body is very limited. And this is a way of getting it legalized while they try to move on to the next stage. In America, more obviously, it goes back to the family who might use it in their gardens. They might spread it among family members. They might use it. Sometimes they take it to a special place, to a woodland site. They can ask for it to go to a national park. So you really have got this, you know, in natural burial, there is this dialogue of gifting your body to the earth in a way that will get more, that will lead to fertility. And in the case of natural burial, it is less true than people would like it to be because of the depth that the body is usually at. Whereas with composting, it absolutely is true. This is compost and you can grow things in it. And this is what I meant about the conversation around decomposition, because somebody was saying, well, this is actually an ancient thing. We've always been doing this, but now we're trying to commodify it. We're trying to put a technology to it. And, you know, trust me, if you bury a body and then you dig it up 20 years later, what you've got is not compost. So this is a new technology, actually. And yes, it is utilizing natural processes, but it is utilizing them in a very new way. And it doesn't involve, again, it involves less input. There's the construction of the materials in the first place, but then there is less of an energy input even than there is for resumation. So if you were asking me what is my preferred as a funeral director, as somebody concerned with ecology, and as a druid and a ritualist, I would say composting is the way forward.
Thank you, Jenny. 1 second. Thank you. So hard to translate what you're talking. Jenny, 1:10 here, 12 there. I will say thank you. It was amazing. It was wonderful. Thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to see you. Take care and see you soon.
And you. Hope the conference goes well.
It's going great. Honestly, it's
Brilliant.
going great. So
Brilliant.
happy.
I'll catch up with you soon. Take care.